Well, welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with C2G, and I'm speaking today with Shuchi Talati, who's the founder of the recently launched Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, as well as the co-chair of the Independent Advisory Committee to oversee SCoPEx, a potential outdoor solar geoengineering experiment proposed by Harvard University. Before this latest venture, Dr. Talati served as Chief of Staff of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the US Department of Energy, where she focused on creating just and sustainable frameworks for carbon dioxide removal. She was also previously the Deputy Director of Policy at Carbon 180 and the Fellow in Geoengineering Research Governance and Public Engagement at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Shuchi Talati, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. Well, let's start with why we're here ultimately. What are your top line big thoughts on where we are in the climate challenge? How serious a situation are we in today, and how would you characterize humanity's current state of efforts to tackle it?
So starting with a very simple question, I see. I think we're in a very challenging situation, but by no means do I think it's one that we can't tackle. I think, historically, we haven't done a particularly good job at handling climate change over the last 30, 40 years. I don't think we've done a good job at taking into consideration climate impacts thus far and how they might, perpetuate into the future, taking into consideration, the deep need for widespread adaptation, need for loss and damage, need for carbon dioxide removal and mitigation, of course. And I think all of these things are, parts of the portfolio that we're just starting to address, and where, we've seen recent landmark climate legislation pass in the United States, but that's a first step. And I'm really, both worried about how that might, continue into the future, but at the same time, really heartened to see, this huge moment of progress in the US. Globally, I think we're seeing kind of similar movements towards, thinking about the different components that, have to happen across this wide portfolio. At the same time, it's not happening fast enough. So all of these things are kind of coming together for me. And I think my kind of biggest concern in this space is kind of where I started, which is impacts. We're seeing so many impacts affect so many people in kind of the most vulnerable places today. And I don't think we're really thinking about how that's going to, become a much larger problem over the next several decades. Even if we were to hit net zero tomorrow, in the most ideal, optimistic version of that, which is likely 2050, we're going to see impacts continue to worsen for the next several decades. And we're not making that a central part of the conversation around climate change.
Just to sort of bring that to a sense of what's happened recently, we had these apocalyptic scenes in New York, red skies due to the Canadian wildfires. I was wondering if in the US you've seen, or whether you think we'll ever see one of those moments where suddenly, people theoretically know about climate change and do or don't agree with it on an intellectual basis, but do you think people have got that sort of emotional moment where they're thinking, oh, wow, this is really here, it really affects me? Are we at that point or nearing that point?
I think we've seen a lot of those moments for people in very different ways. And I think, as we think about all the different types of impacts of climate change, those are the ones that people are seeing for themselves across different geographies and regions, right? Whether it be wildfire smoke or hurricanes or drought or food security issues, I think there's definitely a realization that climate change is impacting all of these things. And I think now the questions are, how willing are people to actually engage in changing the politics of the system to actually affect better policy?
So ending CO2 emissions in the first place is the priority. When in a hole, stop digging. But over recent years, there's been growing interest in large-scale carbon removal. And I bring this up because you've obviously done a lot of work on this in the past. Had a lot of experience in government and in an NGO called Carbon 180. Describe where you see the state of carbon removal right now. Is it mainstream? Are we beginning to see a pushback against it? And how do you see the evolving debate around its governance, how to measure it, how to put it alongside other policies? What is the state of CDR right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the state of CDR is shocking to me, actually. I think if we look back even 5 years ago, the idea that there would be billions of public dollars going into carbon dioxide removal would be unprecedented. And so I think we're kind of seeing quite a bit of hype around the potential for CDR, and a lot of new entrepreneurial ventures, a lot more private companies coming into this space. I think that's incredibly exciting to see, kind of flourishing R&D, and the potential for really new, exciting systems to actually capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. At the same time, I don't think governance has kept up with that pace. I remain deeply concerned about how we create a system that is not profit motivated, that is disentangled from the fossil fuel industry, and that actually leads to effective, permanent, durable carbon dioxide removal. We have really problematic offset markets. We have problematic systems in which there are perverse incentives related to CDR, and we have to think about what we need to build, what guardrails we need to make sure that CDR is done effectively. And there's a lot more thinking on that has to be done. I think when it comes to trust and ensuring that just outcomes are the priority, we have never really done robust public engagement to the level that is needed, at the scale that is needed, to ensure that the system can have legitimacy. And thinking about what that looks like is really not something that the Department of Energy and I think other comparable agencies in the world have really done effectively before. And so thinking about, please, yeah.
Well, no, I'd love to pick you up on that point in a second and dig into it. I just wanted to go back briefly to some of the concerns you raised, the governance challenges, before we go into the justice issue. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, the concept of high integrity removals and how you actually go about measuring it and monitoring it and verifying it. But I wanted to go into what's often the most, I don't know, the critique that people most often jump on, which is known as the moral hazard or mitigation deterrence, or basically the idea that by saying we can remove carbon from the atmosphere, that lessens the pressure on society to not put it in there in the first place. Where do you see the state of that, and also policy to make sure it doesn't happen?
I think it's still very much a central issue in CDR that we have to keep thinking about what policy mechanisms can ensure that we don't end up in that space. I think, as we all know, it's much easier to avoid emissions than to remove them. It's much cheaper, it's more effective, and we have to ensure that mitigation is the priority. When we think about this concept of net zero, which has a lot of issues surrounding it, but we have to think about the role of CDR in getting to net zero, and then separately the role of CDR in actually addressing legacy emissions. For me, CDR should play as small as role as possible when it comes to mitigative measures, right? We don't want to build CDR that has allowable offsets, just generally speaking, right? We want to make sure that CDR is used for the hardest to decarbonize sectors, right? But more importantly for me is using CDR to address legacy emissions, to address things like overshoot, and making sure that we actually have the capacity available to address those aspects of the climate system. How to do that, I think, remains a huge question in my mind. And I think the idea of moral hazard is, it changes over time, right? I think right now we do need to think about doing large scale R&D. We have to think about what we need to do to prepare to scale, and that takes investment, right? But as we start getting down the road, that's when we have to think about what is the role of CDR as compared to large mitigation systems. What is the role of renewable electricity in use for CDR systems, while we also need renewables to phase out things like coal and natural gas. And these are really big policy questions that I don't think we've had the opportunity to really think about at kind of the federal level yet. And this is going to take state level policy, federal policy, and global policy to really think about how these systems will interact with each other. Because the ways that make sense in the United States might not make sense in places like India or China. And we have to really make sure that these technologies have guardrails around them and are used in the most effective ways.
And so going back, I guess that brings us back nicely to the question of justice. How do we go about involving different communities around the world affected by climate change in understanding carbon removal, picking the right policies for carbon removal, giving consent where necessary for their land or whatever to be used for aspects of carbon removal, whether actually nature-based or machines or transport or storage or whatever. And actually moving a little bit further than that, the concept of justice is, could you see carbon removal as a tool of justice in a sense whereby historic polluters who's benefited most from the fossil fuel economy actually have the weight of the responsibility to take out what they put in the first place, actually redress some of the harms they've done? If we could just touch on that a little bit before we move on to your current work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to the first question of how do we do this, I think it's a huge question. And I think the first thing for me is to start. I think we really haven't tackled large scale engagement, knowledge building, and just awareness building around these types of emerging topics. I think that's true of CDR and solar geoengineering. And I think it's going to take a lot of resources and effort to figure out the best ways to do that. It's going to take trial and error, and we have to make sure that we're doing that in ways that are unbiased, that are done by actors that have trust. And that's incredibly challenging. I think when we think about, engaging on specific projects and making sure that, people have voices and decisions, communities have power to say no to projects that they don't want. These are systems that really don't exist yet. And so thinking about how to build them, and what that looks like at this front end of kind of early demonstrations versus commercialization, are things that we have to talk about at important federal policy levels. And I think that's starting to happen, which is incredibly exciting to see. But when we have a lot of political volatility in a lot of different countries, it's really concerning to see fluctuation and commitment to these types of issues fluctuate. Because if you lose momentum around them, you inevitably will see, people being less engaged from this space.
So do you see an order then in which countries should be engaging in carbon removal? Should it be the developed world does it first and foremost, goes negative earlier? Is there a sense that it could be using as a tool to help with the differentiated responsibilities in addressing historic injustice?
I think that's a possibility, but I don't really think that's a decision that we could make, right? I think countries will have to make those decisions for themselves to best decide what pathways make the most sense for them from a labor perspective, justice perspective, energy perspective, resource perspective. And those are not decisions that I think we can make for them. But I think thinking about ways in which CDR could be used as a tool for things like climate reparations is a really important conversation. What is the role of rich nations in developing an incredibly expensive technology, and implementing it and making sure that it's being used in the best way? I think it's a really, really important topic that I don't think we've spent enough time with as a global community. And we need a lot more awareness and participation from the countries that would potentially be either places where CDR is deployed or places where, that would be, quote unquote, receiving benefits from this type of technology. But that in itself is a tricky issue, right? Defining what benefits are from CDR is challenging.
And I guess there's an awful lot of commonalities between what you've addressed now regarding CDR on some of these issues and your current work regarding solar geoengineering. So you've started up this project, the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. I'm going to ask you all about it in a second, but first of all, I'd love to hear you describe it. What is solar geoengineering, and how might it harm or help our efforts to reduce climate risks?
Yeah, of course. So solar geoengineering refers to large-scale efforts that reflect sunlight to cool the planet. The reason we think this might work is because we've seen, large volcanic eruptions. Most recently, Mount Pinatubo in 1991, which released, a large amount of sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere, which cooled the entire planet by over 0.5 degrees Celsius for over a year. whether or not this would be an effective strategy to address some types of climate impacts remains to be seen. It is a potential approach that could potentially limit a lot of human suffering and harm, but it might not. It's an incredibly double-edged sword where it could potentially address some of the injustices that we've perpetuated from climate change. At the same time, it could potentially exacerbate them. And the biggest challenge here is that we don't actually know what climate vulnerable communities want. And when it comes to solar geoengineering, knowledge around it, awareness of it, even in the global north, remains very, very low. And so when we see people in the global north, talking about what should happen, it's being done in a very kind of elite, narrow way. I think the loudest voices we see are largely global north white elite actors making claims on behalf of these communities. And so when we think about what we need to do to kind of build a better system, to build a potentially more just and inclusive system, that really starts with knowledge and engagement. And so this effort that I recently launched in April is focused on that. How do we best build kind of more inclusive and just deliberation around this topic?
And before we jump into that, and I'm really looking forward to that because it's such a big topic, I just wanted to get a sense of all the reasons you outlined are very good reasons. However, there's a lot of people who are scared by this topic, think they shouldn't talk about it at all, don't want to jump into it, and almost see those who do engage with this topic as, I don't know, having gone off track or having a curious. What motivated you to really pursue your interest in solar geoengineering? What led you to think, wow, this is something I need to dedicate myself to?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me because I completely understand kind of the fear and the reaction to this topic as one being totally crazy. And it is absolutely insane. And you will get no argument from me on that. I think the fact that we're having to think about solar geoengineering in itself is unfortunately very insane. And I'm really, really sad that we're at this point. But we are here, and not talking about solar geoengineering will not make it go away. This is not something that only exists on the fringes. It is becoming, a part of major assessments and processes. And not talking about it, I think, actually is a contributor to unjust outcomes. And when we see voices saying that, we shouldn't even be able to talk about this, to me, that's, a very clear symbol of privilege, where we've seen a lot of these actors have had the opportunity to engage with this topic and to come to the opinion that this is not something we should do. That is absolutely a valid opinion. But from my perspective, we have to also make sure that other people have that same opportunity to engage with this topic. And limiting that is unfortunately very symbolic of how, colonialism has perpetuated in the past. I think, in terms of why I came to this topic, it's been a winding 15 years of my career in climate change. And, I spent a lot of time on different approaches, thinking about, mitigation and adaptation in different ways. And I've been working on CDR for some time, but, I've been thinking a lot about climate impacts and kind of the huge dearth of action in this space. And thinking about solar geoengineering as, potentially a very important way to address things like heat waves or things like sea level rise. And we don't know the answers to these things yet, but we don't have a lot of adaptation solutions that can address some of the things that solar geoengineering may potentially be able to address. And so thinking about, this kind of deep human rights component to solar geoengineering, which, to be clear, should be the only reason to consider solar geoengineering. There should be no profit motivation behind this whatsoever. But thinking about that perspective and the fact that we're seeing such little engagement from the most vulnerable was really concerning to me. And really the dangers of solar geoengineering and the fact that this is something that is, relatively inexpensive, could happen very quickly, makes it the complete opposite of CDR in those key ways, right? And I really see this as a very narrow window of opportunity to be able to actually build knowledge and awareness, build capacity to engage in governance on this topic, that if we don't start doing now, I think it'll be too late. And so other than, you know, the amazing work that C2G does, the Degrees Initiative, I really wasn't seeing very much action in this space. And so I really wanted to think about how I could contribute to kind of building a better path to, you know, just outcomes, to inclusion that we just really haven't done enough on at all, really across the climate space.
So as you, I mean, it's explicitly stated on your website that your mission is to work towards just and inclusive deliberation about research and potential use of solar geoengineering. I think few could, in a sense, argue on one level with the ideas behind that, but in practice, what does that mean? What does it look like? What are the challenges? How are you actually going to go about deciding how to do it and what to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly hard, right? And this is something that there aren't really good models of, and I'm trying to kind of learn from kind of the best versions of community engagement, the best versions of capacity building that have existed thus far, and try and stand on their shoulders around this topic. You know, I think when we look at capacity building as kind of an overall topic over the last 100 years, we haven't done it very well. They've been very kind of one-off efforts that have been very biased, that have been not sustainable, and they've been, you know, led by, you know, efforts that have very particular outcomes in mind. What I wanted to try and build were efforts that build knowledge in sustainable ways that are locally led and built to empower the perspectives of the people on the ground. And that's very hard. And
Right.
thinking about kind of the ways to build partnerships and collaborations, to build kind of the best versions of kind of resources, right? Like, how do you kind of build materials and kind of mechanisms that make sense for the people in different places, takes time. And people learn in different ways. You know, different communities will have different things that they want to, you know, learn more about. And all of this is hard work. But I'm excited to try and figure it out. And I by no means want to claim expertise around this type of work so far. I am also learning. I'm building my own capacity and trying to do this work. And I think it's important to say that, right? That, like, I'm not trying to kind of build a certain kind of knowledge towards a certain kind of outcome. The only thing I'm really advocating for in this organization is procedural justice. You know, this idea that we have to think about fairness in decision making. And kind of that's my kind of leading priority in trying to think about the best ways to do this.
I mean, as you mentioned, as you've been doing this exploration and learning yourself, you're inspired and seeing the great work of some others. Can you give a sense of who they are and what kind of models have made you think, wow, that's the kind of way I'd like to approach this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different kind of leaders in this space that I've learned a lot from. And, you know, I think there are, you know, leaders kind of in countries that I'm hoping to engage with, like Salim Al-Hook, who's led a lot of interesting and effective capacity building efforts in least developed countries with the organization that he's leading. I think there's also really amazing work done on kind of advocacy for public engagement and efforts like CDR that we're seeing in the United States. You know, efforts led by, you know, Carbon 180 and the National Wildlife Federation, American University, all these kinds of organizations that are thinking about how do we build the best version of public engagement. I think there are also a lot of writings from scholars and kind of, you know, philosophers who have really thought about how we think about ethics and morality in this space. And I've had the privilege of working with some of them in some of my own writings around this topic. And so I think there are so many things that I am drawing from and building upon, and I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to engage with. And I think, but a lot of this too, I think is work that we are building from the ground up, and thinking about, you know, what does justice really mean for solar geoengineering? What are the intersections in this space? What does inclusion mean, right? I think that's a word that's used a lot. I think it's thrown around kind of all over the place, but we're kind of really thinking about what inclusion in kind of solar geoengineering deliberation means. I think is actually incredibly important to say, if we want to get to just outcomes, what does that look like? Like what is kind of the best version of it? And I think we also have to kind of really think about engaging with the uncomfortable, right? Like solar geoengineering isn't an easy thing to talk about, how it fits into the climate response portfolio, why people do or don't want to talk about it. These are all really hard questions. And I don't think there are enough organizations, I don't think civil societies have the opportunity to engage with this topic enough. And that has to start shifting. And so thinking about how DSG can also impact that narrative to say, like, it's okay that we don't know the answers to these questions, but we have to start talking about them. And then to be kind of like that honest broker in the space, which I think is something that has largely been missing, to be kind of a voice of trust and kind of learning in a field that has been very empty.
That's such an important issue, the question of honest broker and trust. There is this difficult situation, I think, sometimes in this field, whereby if you go to somebody and say, here's the thing you haven't really heard about, let's talk about it so that we can, govern it properly and all the rest of it, there can be a response of, oh, you're advocating for this. Yep. And there's a sense of, well, why would you have brought it up for me in the first place if you didn't think this is something? How do you be neutral, impartial, while at the same time you are proactively saying this is something that we need to talk about? And how do you convince people of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about being very clear about my motivations, right? My motivation is not to advocate for this in any which way, but it's to say that, outside of, this organization and my work, there is momentum growing in this space. We are seeing it across sectors, in the UN, in the US government, at academic institutions, and in research institutions, right? We're seeing a really growing shift in the way people are talking about it and engaging with it. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in the private sector too, with recent kind of efforts to deploy solar geoengineering and sell cooling credits. And so my motivation is to say that this is happening, and regardless of how you feel about this topic, you deserve to be engaged on it and to be part of, the decision making that is happening. And by not talking about it, you are actively disempowering yourself from this conversation. And if that's not something that you want to do, like, that's absolutely fine. But I think that opportunity and awareness of this topic and those processes, it's incredibly important for people to be aware of.
And in your experience so far, as you've been doing this and speaking to a whole bunch of people, what sort of responses have you got? Is this approach working? And I'd obviously love any sort of specific examples, but I also understand that a lot of these conversations have to be quiet, but just to understand how this work is evolving and some sort of practical examples would be great.
Yeah, I mean, so this is very new, right? So this is work that I started scoping out a year ago, and I just launched this organization in April, right? So I feel like, trying to have these conversations is something that we're actively doing, right? And so in terms of kind of the responses thus far, I mean, I think that has been kind of an effective way to engage people, right? And to say that, I want to help build capacity in ways that are kind of most important and most effective for you. And you can or can't do anything with that information. That it's entirely up to you. But if you would be willing to kind of think about if that might make sense, seems to be a really good way to kind of bring people to just a conversation. And I think those are just critical first steps to building relationships, right? Like, I can't go in and say, I want to kind of lead a capacity building effort in your country. Like, that's not going to work. That's also entirely not sustainable and not effective. I want to think about ways to empower locally led efforts in ways that can be, sustained and kind of built by the people who are in these places, and in whatever ways that kind of is, in whatever ways the resources can be kind of built or provided by this organization. That's what I want to contribute to.
Will you be focusing on any particular continent to begin with? Have you been sort of starting things out in any particular place in terms of feeling out for the willingness to engage and ways to engage?
Yes, I mean, at this point, kind of, we're thinking about how to prioritize different places and where it makes sense to go first. So far, South Asia is a place that I think will be incredibly important to engage with. I'm hoping to go to Africa and South and Central America later this year and early next year. And it's, all of these places are just so critical to have their perspectives, and figuring out kind of where to start collaborations and projects, I think, will be kind of steered by them, where responses are stronger, where the civil society landscape is empowered for us to engage with, and just where people are interested. And I hope that that's something that isn't entirely dictated from the front end, right? I think it has to be, there's a huge part of this that is supply driven, right? Because the whole problem is that there isn't this demand because there isn't knowledge. But at the same time, as we start having these conversations, there has to be some sort of demand pull for some of this work to be built. And we don't know the answers to that yet because no one's engaged with them yet. And so I hope that becomes clear to us over the next, year, 2 years, 3 years. And I hope it's, work that is driven by the communities that we want to engage with.
Great. Well, look, I really look forward to seeing where this goes. It's exciting. Let's take one example, though, where something did happen very specifically, which underlined, I guess, some of the reasons why you're doing this work. Is there was this controversy in 2021 when Harvard was looking to do the SCoPEx experiment over the skies of Sweden. The Sami Council found out about it, indigenous groups found out about it and opposed it, and this led effectively to the cancellation, at least, of that part of the project. You are co-chair of the independent advisory committee to oversee this experiment. Not so long ago, I think it was last year, the committee gave recommendations on how to improve local engagement. I just wonder if you could just share a little bit about, what the outcome of learning has been from what happened with that experiment, and what practically is going to happen now to take this forward.
Yeah, I think an incredibly important learning for the committee after what happened in Sweden was thinking about how people perceive solar geoengineering experimentation. The committee had built kind of guidelines for public engagement before Sweden, and when we thought about when communities should be engaged, we made this assertion that, for the engineering test flight to actually just test the equipment, we didn't necessarily need to think about public engagement yet. Rather, we should focus on that for the particle release, for the actual experimental portion of kind of the whole entire project. And so that's what was happening in Sweden. It was the test of the equipment. That was a mistake. That is not how people perceive this work. And so the new kind of guidelines we built kind of thought about how this is a holistic thing, and we have to make sure that engagement is done at the front end. At the same time, this committee was put together in efforts to build oversight for an experiment that was supposed to be domestic. So we were a group of, largely American scholars and some global South scholars to think about kind of all the different components of a governance framework for these experiments, which is, public and available online, that we hope will be something that is utilized by future kind of research groups. But, this experiment then kind of moved to a place where we were not prepared to, provide the same type of governance. We didn't have any Swedish experts, Sami experts, language speakers on our committee. And that was a mistake. And so when we think about kind of future experiments and kind of the role of kind of research governance and ad hoc committees that have this oversight, what we have learned is that it is very hard, and the best thing we can do is to be as anticipatory as possible. I think understanding the location and the needs of a particular experiment is absolutely necessary for us to be able to provide kind of the right and appropriate governance. And I think the earlier kind of these pieces start, kind of the better, the kind of folks engaged in governance can be prepared to provide the right kinds of tools. And so, so now SCoPEx it's not canceled. I mean, yet we don't know what's going to happen, but these are local engagement guidelines that we've provided to the research team, and they are taking that up and trying to figure out what are the best ways to kind of deploy those guidelines for this experiment.
Earlier, you mentioned, with consultations when you were talking a little bit about the right to say no. Now, I know it's quite hard to answer this in the abstract, and every case will be different. But how do you go about determining who has the right to say no? Do some people have privilege over others in terms of their ability to say no? And what if the no, obviously there's clearly, for example, with something like SCoPEx, takes place over Sweden, right? But at the same time, it has potential consequences for the whole world. And how do you determine the sort of kind of mix of local versus global right to say no or right to say yes? Or it seems to be such a complex question. On one level, it sounds obvious, somebody has the right to say no, but on another level, I don't know, where do we ever have the right to say no? So I'm interested in your thoughts of that.
It's really hard, right? Because I think there's also this kind of entanglement of NIMBYism that has been very pervasive in the renewable energy industry, that has also been quite challenging because a lot of NIMBYism has existed in very rich, privileged areas where they just don't want, wind turbines impinging on their view, right? Or versus, actual legitimate concerns around air pollution or resource use. And I think the challenge is that these are not systems that we have had experience with yet. And I've said this a lot during our conversation, but we just haven't figured that out, right? And we have to think about what are the right types of governance structures that could actually take in the input from a community to actually parse that input and then, think about what the right decision-making structure then is, right? Is the input, based on kind of the actual needs and concerns of the community, or is it based on a select few that are, don't have the same motivations? And all of this to say is I don't think we know what the best system is yet. And I think public engagement is one of those things that's very easy to talk about in theory and very hard to do in practice. And public engagement is not kind of a one-size-fits-all thing, right? It has to exist for different purposes with different people, and to do different things. And those are, systems that we just really haven't created for solar geoengineering, for carbon dioxide removal. I mean, for renewable energy in the best possible way yet. I think there's still a lot of learning to be done. But when it comes to, the right to say no and, the right to veto, I think these are things we're going to see play out in the very near future. We have, especially in the United States, we have a lot of big projects that are being funded by the Infrastructure Act, especially around carbon dioxide removal. We see the DAC program. And thinking about, who is running the public engagement? Is it the companies? Is it the Department of Energy? Is it the local government? Is it nonprofit organizations? We don't know yet, and I think we're about to find out what that's going to look like.
Well, we're already seeing some hints with some of the pipelines and so forth.
Yeah,
the CO2 pipelines. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the hardest things I see in that space is going to be trust. And it's going to be actually seeing a voice for themselves in the eventual outcomes. Because trust isn't just built at the front end. If they have to see kind of, did you actually use their input? Are you responding to it? And And I don't think we've been able to see that quite yet, but I think it's going to be a very, very active space over the next few
I've always
years.
thought of trust as a function of predictability over time, and it's quite hard to shortcut the time. I just wanted to go back to your own motivation. You and perhaps we'll end on this. You talked a lot about some of the specifics of why SRM, but just take a step back. It takes quite a lot of motivation to set up an organization in a difficult field, not really knowing where it's going, controversial, self-doubt must come in. I could just do an easy job with the private sector. Where do you get your broader motivation from? Do you have any philosophies or heroes or standards that you hold yourself by that drives you forwards?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hard question. I mean, I think there are so many motivations for me, and I think the kind of two or three biggest ones, I think first and foremost are, my family, right? My family is from India. My parents immigrated here. I'm first generation, and kind of thinking about my role kind of between these two types of societies is one that I've grappled with my whole life. And I think climate change really puts kind of a lens on kind of how these roles intersect with each other and how important they both are. I think climate change for me has been kind of a central motivation in my entire career and education. And this kind of need for civil society and accountability and policy building in ways that are not profit driven, that are not kind of led by, largely white men, is just such an important driver for this type of work. I think as a woman of color, I've seen how empty the solar geoengineering space is of people who look like me. And that's a huge problem. And so that's also kind of been a driver for how I wanted to think about this work and what my role could be. And I think the challenge with something like this is like accepting and knowing that I can't solve the biggest problems in this field, even given like how small this field is right now. But to think about what path could I be most impactful on? And, this to me was a clear space that needed to be filled, wasn't being filled, and one that I think also needed to be filled by, a woman, by a person of color, by and by hopefully an organization that is, dedicated to lifting up the voices of the disempowered. And I think there are a lot of different philosophies that are kind of intertwined with kind of making these decisions, but kind of the principles of justice and how climate justice is not pervasive enough in how we're making decisions has become really central to me over the last few years. And, that's been really central to how I've been thinking about carbon dioxide removal. But as, carbon dioxide removal as a field has become, much larger and hopefully will become a lot more inclusive and diverse, I'm not seeing the same type of growth in solar geoengineering. And so that's kind of really why I was driven to pursue this for this topic specifically, is that there's potentially a lot that will happen over the next 10 years. And if, we don't start kind of thinking about building that diversity now, it'll be too late.
Well, Shuchi Talati, thanks for being such a great guest on C2GTalk.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.